It was a warm evening on September 15, 2005, when the quiet town of Riverton, Missouri, was jolted by the kind of news that ripples through a community and leaves scars that never fully heal. The lifeless body of Jessica Langley, a 28-year-old mother of two and beloved piano teacher, was found sprawled in the small chapel of St. Mark's Church. The cause of death was immediately apparent: blunt force trauma to the head. Blood stained the altar steps, the crimson smear contrasting starkly with the pristine white cloths that adorned the sacred space. Jessica was the epitome of grace and kindness, a devoted wife to her husband, David Langley, and a doting mother to their young children, Ethan and Lily. She was the type of woman everyone in Riverton knew and everyone in Riverton loved. Her marriage to David, a successful attorney known for his dedication to the community, was viewed as picture perfect. But as the police cordoned off the chapel and began their investigation, it quickly became clear that Jessica's life was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. To understand the events that led to Jessica's brutal murder, the detectives had to dig beneath the surface of her seemingly idyllic life. Jessica and David had been married for 8 years, living in a beautiful suburban home with a picket fence and a lush garden, everything you'd expect from a couple whose lives were the envy of many. But as the detectives interviewed friends and neighbors, a different picture of Jessica began to emerge, one of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, searching desperately for something she couldn't find at home. David Langley was a man of success, but also a man of distance. At 40, his career was thriving, but his marriage was not. David's long hours and frequent business trips meant that Jessica was often left alone, managing the household and caring for their children with little support. Over time, the couple had grown apart, with Jessica finding herself increasingly lonely and disconnected from the man she had once promised to love forever. Amidst this growing void in her personal life, Jessica found solace in the last place anyone would expect: the church. She had always been devout, attending Mass every Sunday without fail. St. Mark's Church was a cornerstone of her routine, and Father Paul Harris, the 52-year-old parish priest, had become a trusted confidant. Father Paul was a familiar face, known for his warmth and his ability to make people feel understood. With his gentle voice and compassionate demeanor, he was a pillar of the community. But Father Paul was not the man everyone believed him to be. Before coming to Riverton, he had been quietly transferred from his previous parish under a cloud of scandal, an affair with a married woman, and whispers of manipulation that the church had quickly swept under the rug. In Riverton, Father Paul found a fresh start, but his past behaviors lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Jessica and Father Paul's relationship began innocently enough. What started as casual conversations after Mass evolved into weekly meetings, often under the guise of spiritual guidance. Father Paul was there when Jessica needed someone to talk to, listening to her fears, her frustrations, and her dreams. He provided the comfort and attention she desperately craved, but as time passed, the line between priest and parishioner began to blur. Jessica found herself drawn to Father Paul in ways she couldn't quite understand, and he, in turn, became increasingly fixated on her. The first time they crossed the line was on a rainy afternoon in Father Paul's private office at the church. Jessica had been upset, venting about a recent argument with David, and Father Paul had offered a comforting hand on her shoulder. One moment led to another, and before they knew it, they were locked in a passionate embrace. The guilt was immediate, but so was the thrill. As the affair continued, it became a secret both of them were desperate to protect. Jessica would invent reasons to visit the church, extra choir practices, charity work, anything that would give her an excuse to be alone with Father Paul. The clandestine nature of their meetings only heightened the intensity, and soon what had started as an emotional crutch had spiraled into a full-blown obsession. Father Paul, once the gentle and wise advisor, began to change. He became possessive and controlling, his obsession with Jessica consuming him. He would call her late at night, insisting that she come to the church, even if it meant leaving her children with a neighbor. He pressured her to leave David, painting vivid pictures of a future where they could be together openly, without the constraints of secrecy. Jessica, however, was caught in an emotional web. She couldn't bring herself to leave David, not only because of their children, but also because the reality of abandoning her life terrified her. The affair had become a trap, one that filled her with both exhilaration and dread. She knew she was living on borrowed time, but she was too entangled to find a way out. The affair between Jessica and Father Paul continued in secret, but the pressure of maintaining the facade began to weigh heavily on both of them. Father Paul's behavior grew increasingly erratic, oscillating between declarations of love and bouts of jealousy. He was no longer content with stolen moments. He wanted Jessica all to himself. The priest's obsession darkened as he felt her slipping away, and he began pushing her to make an impossible choice. Jessica's life had become a balancing act of lies. She was torn between her responsibilities as a mother and wife and the magnetic pull of her affair. David, though often absent, started to notice the changes in Jessica, her distracted demeanor, the excuses that no longer seemed to add up, and the way she often glanced at her phone waiting for a message that never seemed to come at the right time. The tension between them grew, with unspoken accusations hanging in the air. David, driven by suspicion, decided to take matters into his own hands. He began keeping a closer eye on Jessica, noting her absences and erratic behavior. One evening, after Jessica had rushed off to meet with a friend, David quietly followed her. What he discovered that night would change everything. Jessica didn't go to her friend's house. Instead, she drove straight to St. Mark's Church, parking in the dimly lit lot at the back. David watched from a distance as Jessica disappeared inside. Moments later, he saw Father Paul usher her into the building, glancing around nervously before closing the door. David's stomach churned with a mix of anger and betrayal. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, and he didn't like the picture they painted. The next day, David confronted Jessica about her whereabouts. She stumbled over her words, her face paling under his intense gaze. The conversation was tense, filled with half-truths and deflections. Jessica knew she was cornered but couldn't bring herself to admit the affair. The guilt was suffocating, and she was terrified of losing everything. David, sensing her evasion, decided to dig deeper. He hired a private investigator, determined to get to the bottom of his wife's secret life. The investigator's findings were swift and damning. Photos of Jessica and Father Paul meeting in secluded spots, texts exchanged at odd hours, and whispered phone calls confirmed David's worst fears. Jessica wasn't just unfaithful, she was involved with the one person David had always trusted implicitly, a man who was supposed to guide their family spiritually, not tear it apart. David was livid. The betrayal felt like a knife to the heart. But rather than confront Jessica directly, he chose a more calculated approach. He wanted them both to pay, but he wanted to do it on his terms. David's plan began to take shape. He would catch them red-handed, and they would have no way to deny their sins. On the night of September 14th, the plan fell into place. David had learned from the investigator that Jessica and Father Paul had arranged to meet in the chapel. David prepared himself mentally for what he knew would be an emotionally devastating encounter. He arrived at the church shortly after Jessica, his heart pounding as he crept through the darkened halls. The chapel was dimly lit by candlelight, and he could hear the muffled voices of Jessica and Father Paul. David stood at the entrance, watching as Father Paul held Jessica close, whispering sweet promises that David knew were nothing but poison. The sight of them together, so intimate, so wrapped up in their deception, was the final straw. The anger surged within him, white-hot and uncontrollable. David stepped forward, his face a mask of fury. Jessica gasped as she saw him, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Father Paul's expression shifted from surprise to fear as he saw the rage in David's eyes. David lunged, grabbing Father Paul by the collar and slamming him against the altar. Jessica screamed, trying to pull David away, but he was beyond reasoning. In the chaos that followed, the argument escalated into a physical altercation. David, fueled by months of pent-up anger and betrayal, struck Father Paul with a brass candlestick that had been resting on the altar. The blow was vicious, fueled by all the pain and humiliation David had endured. Father Paul collapsed, his head striking the marble steps, blood pooling rapidly beneath him. Jessica was frozen, torn between rushing to Father Paul's aid and trying to calm her husband. David turned to her, his eyes wild and unrecognizable. "How could you?" he shouted, his voice breaking. Jessica backed away, her tears flowing as she tried to explain the unexplainable. But before she could speak, David's fury turned physical. He shoved Jessica away, sending her crashing into the pews. The noise echoed through the empty chapel, mingling with Jessica's sobs and the soft moans of the injured priest. As Father Paul lay dying and Jessica struggled to regain her footing, David stared at the scene he had created, the irrevocable damage, the broken trust, and the blood-stained altar that once symbolized sanctuary. The scene was set for a tragedy that would haunt them all. As the reality of what he had done set in, David's rage began to fade, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. Father Paul lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored, while Jessica sat slumped against the pew, clutching her side where she had fallen. The once sacred space was now a grisly crime scene, stained with betrayal and blood. David knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he still had a choice to make. In a moment of panicked clarity, he grabbed Jessica by the arm and pulled her toward the exit. "We need to leave, now." His voice was tense, stripped of the fury that had driven him moments earlier. Jessica, still in shock, nodded weakly, allowing herself to be led away. They left Father Paul lying in the chapel, bleeding and alone. David drove recklessly, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. Jessica sat in silence, her eyes red and swollen, the weight of the night's events hanging heavily between them. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to make sense of the chaos, but the words wouldn't come. They returned home, but it was clear that nothing could return to normal. Jessica's guilt was overwhelming. The affair, the lies, and now the violence, it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. David's anger simmered beneath the surface, replaced by a grim determination to protect his family no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the scene at St. Mark's Church didn't go unnoticed for long. The next morning, a parishioner discovered Father Paul's body lying in the chapel and called the authorities. The police arrived quickly, securing the area and launching a full investigation. The discovery of Jessica's bloodied earring and the traces of struggle told a clear story of an altercation, but the identities of those involved remained a mystery, at least initially. As detectives pieced together the evidence, they questioned everyone connected to the church, including David and Jessica. Both maintained a carefully crafted lie, feigning shock at the news of Father Paul's condition. However, the weight of their secret was unbearable, and cracks began to show. Jessica, overcome with guilt and anxiety, became reclusive, barely speaking and avoiding eye contact during questioning. David, though more composed, couldn't hide the anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior. The pressure mounted as investigators found footage from a security camera across the street showing Jessica's car near the church on the night of the incident. When confronted with the evidence, Jessica broke down, admitting to her affair with Father Paul but insisting that his injuries had been an accident. She sobbed as she recounted the fight, painting it as a moment of heated emotion that spiraled out of control. David was arrested and charged with assault, but the situation took a darker turn when Father Paul succumbed to his injuries 2 days later. The charge was upgraded to manslaughter, and the community was left reeling from the scandal that unfolded in the once holy chapel. In court, David's defense centered on the betrayal he had felt, his wife's infidelity with a trusted priest, and the emotional turmoil it had caused. His lawyer argued that David's actions, while violent, were a result of momentary insanity, driven by overwhelming heartbreak and rage. The courtroom was filled with tense faces as the story of the affair, the confrontation, and the tragic aftermath played out for everyone to see. Jessica, though not charged, faced her own public trial in the court of public opinion. She became the center of the town's whispers, the woman who had brought scandal and death to their doorstep. Friends turned their backs, and her once thriving piano teaching career crumbled under the weight of the infamy. She was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life, haunted by the choices that had led to such a devastating end. David was ultimately convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. As he was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Jessica one last time, a mix of anger, regret, and an unspoken sense of finality passing between them. Their perfect life was gone, replaced by a shared burden that neither of them could escape. Jessica moved away from Riverton, taking her children with her in search of a fresh start, far from the memories that haunted them, but the shadows of her past followed her wherever she went, a constant reminder of how quickly life could unravel. The affair that had begun as a desperate search for connection had ended in the most tragic way possible, leaving nothing but heartache and loss in its wake. Enjoyed the story? Smash that like button, drop a comment, and share it around. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more wild true crime tales.